Good evening, everyone. Hi, Ross.
Good evening.
I'm just finding my notes. My name is Kate Watson, and I'm the Atlantic publicist at Nimbus Publishing. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special Remembrance Day event. I would like to acknowledge that Nimbus is located in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I encourage you to research and acknowledge the Indigenous people whose land you may be joining us from. Tonight, we're going to hear from Ross Hebb, whose new book, A Canadian Nurse in the Great War, The Diaries of Ruth Logie, 1915 to 1916, was recently released. This is the third book of collected letters that Ross has brought to us, the first two being Letters Home, Maritimers in the Great War, 1914 to 1918, and In Their Own Words, Three Maritimers Experienced the Great War. We at Nimbus are delighted to be able to play a part in keeping these important and enlightening pieces of history alive, and we'd like to thank the province of Nova Scotia and the Canada Council for the Arts for their support in this endeavor. So tonight, after a reading and talk by Dr. Hebb, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So think them up. You can feel free to type them into the chat bar at any time, and we'll bring them up at the end for Ross to answer. And so now tonight, I welcome you to this, and I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Hebb.
Thank you very much, Kate. And thank you, folks, for joining me here this evening. This evening, I'm speaking about the third in the series, as Kate mentioned, of books, A Canadian Nurse in the Great War, The Diaries of Ruth Logie, 1915-1916. Now, when we think about the Great War, what's the sort of thing we think about first? Usually people think about trenches and mud, barbed wire, and no man's land. And above all, people think that, well, that's where the men were. But the Great War, as it turns out, was much more than just a war which involved men. There were many women involved as well, and not just as civilians. In this case, I want to speak about the Canadian Army Medical Corps and the women like nursing sister Ruth Logie, who served in that extraordinary group of women. And I want to speak about Ruth Logie this evening as an individual, but also as representative of that entire grouping of women, Great War nurses. Now, a little bit of background is necessary. The Great War, of course, broke out in August of 1914, and instead of being over by Christmas time, which is what many people thought would be the case, it dragged on, and the casualties increased and increased. And by 1915, it was pretty clear that the war wasn't going to end anytime soon. And so the Canadian government received an offer from McGill University in Montreal, which had a medical school, and they sent an offer to the government in Ottawa offering that they would equip and supply a hospital for service overseas along with the Canadian soldiers who had gone overseas. And by equip, they meant they would send the doctors and surgeons, they would provide the nurses, and they would provide a great deal of the equipment, including 2 motorized ambulances for service overseas. But there was one caveat. The government was not to break the McGill unit and the McGill hospital up and distribute the staff all over the place. And that was the agreement which was struck, and the Canadian government, being desperate for hospital facilities, accepted the offer. And that began the trend within Canada of universities with medical schools offering to the federal government to equip and send a hospital overseas. And it was something which was done by Laval, it was done by Dalhousie, it was even done by St. Francis Xavier in Nova Scotia, a place that had no medical school, but they had lots of graduates who did end up in medicine. So the McGill unit went overseas in 1915, and the McGill unit was no ordinary hospital unit. It had some of the most famous and most qualified doctors of the entire country. It had the latest equipment. They actually went down into the States and bought X-ray machines. It had new ambulances, and also it had a hand-picked cohort of professional nurses. And Ruth Logie was one of those nurses. She had trained in nursing a few years earlier at Montreal General, and she was a nurse in the Montreal area at this time, and she joined up in May of 1915 and then went overseas. Now, as it turns out, she was only in London for a week or so, waiting to be assigned, and they sent her over to the continent because the British Empire was desperate for nurses at that time. And so Ruth Logie found herself in France. But facilities were much less than ideal. There were no fancy hospitals like we have today. They actually were existing in a tent city of hospitals. The surgery units, the wards, the sleeping units for the nurses and the doctors were all in tents. And by November, when the winds picked up and the winter rains began on the coast of France, which is where they were positioned, the tents blew down and the hospital had to be closed up and the nurses sent back to England to other hospitals for the time being until a more permanent and a more settled situation could be discovered. And of course it was later on in 1915. Now, the Canadian Army was very unusual in the terms of the Great War because the Canadian Army, imagine it, did something that no one else in the First World War did. They actually had made their nurses part of the Army because it was the Canadian Army Medical Corps, the CAMC, of which Ruth and the McGill Hospital became a part. And by making the nurses part of the Army, they were granted certain rights and privileges. The nurses were all granted lieutenant officer status, and amazingly for the time, the pay equal to men of that position. So they received officer status, they received the pay that went along with being officers, and also they had very spiffy uniforms. The Canadian nurses were the envy of all the other nurses, the American and the British included, because they had a very sharp dark blue with red piping and brass buttons dress uniform, and they stood out in the streets of London, and because of their rank they actually were saluted by men of different countries, saluting a nurse because they were lieutenants in the Army. Now, this also meant, the other side of the coin, and part of the reason why the Army did it, was that the women were part of the military structure, which meant that they had officer rank, yes, but there were also officers over them, and they had to follow orders. Now, as it turns out, for these women who had been trained in the Canadian and American hospitals, a 3-year course of nurse training before the war, military discipline was not something hard for them to catch on to at all. Matter in some instances, one feels that it was a little bit lighter than the sort of discipline they endured under the matrons in the hospital when they were being trained as nurses during that 3-year course of living in the hospitals and serving in the wards in the nursing training period before the Great War. So the nurses were, the Canadian Army Medical Corps nurses were part of the military. Now, what did they actually do? Well, the nurses did a whole number of things. One of the things that they had to do, which had never been trained to do, was actually set up and establish hospitals. There were no pre-existing hospitals into which they went in France or Belgium, but they had to go and set up hospitals. And this meant setting up not just their own living quarters, which at first were tents, but also the wards, which also were large marquee tents originally, with perhaps room for 10 or 20 patients down each side. Later on in the war, they would be in Nissen huts with about 10 or a dozen patients down each side of the hut. And that was the ward. And you'll see many references in the diary from Ruth about the nurses being in charge of a particular ward. And Ruth constantly is referring to being shifted from one ward to another to another. There were surgical wards, there were medical wards, there were wards devoted to broken legs, other wards devoted to broken hips, other wards devoted to amputated legs, other wards devoted to severe gas cases, other wards devoted to head wounds. And so there was this segregation and specialization within the different wards. Now, the nurses, as they worked in these hospitals, worked in these wards, and their shifts, they usually seemed to work X number of hours in the morning, then have a break in the afternoon and go back again in the evening. And then every once in a while, they were on the night shift. And the night shift meant that it was one nurse and perhaps one orderly, a man, in charge of that ward during the night. And that was a great responsibility because they were in charge of the well-being of all those recovering soldiers in that ward. And they had to watch out for things like hemorrhaging. For instance, a man who had to have a leg or an arm amputated, there was a chance of them breaking out and bleeding during the night. And the wards were not lit. Matter of fact, from 1916 on, the wards had to be in the dark during the night, and just a little light the nurses carried around with them because the German planes were going overhead and bombing the rail lines and the hospitals by the French coast. And so there wasn't a great deal of light. And so the nurses had to be ever vigilant during the night shift, and they'd be on night shift for an entire month at a time in order to catch these wounds and make sure the men didn't hemorrhage and bleed to death during the night on their shift. Other things that the nurses did, well, perhaps first I should describe how the wounded ever came to be at these hospitals by the French coast. A man, say, for instance, is wounded out on the battlefield in no man's land in the region of Ypres. First, there has to be stretcher bearers from his company that pick him up and take him back into the trenches, and then put bandages on him as soon as possible, and then they carry him back through the trench system, if possible. But often the stretcher bearers had to go above ground, out of the trenches, to carry the men because the trenches were not wide enough, and they carried them back, and eventually they got a mile or two behind the front, and there was what was known as a CCS, a casualty clearing station. And that's the first time the wounded soldier would come in contact with actual doctors and a few nurses. Now, the purpose of the casualty clearing stations, which didn't exist at the first part of the war, but were introduced in late 1915 on into 16, is to stabilize the soldier. To stabilize them in instances of shock, to stabilize the injuries sufficiently, not so they could be all fixed up, but so that they could be further transported back to the hospitals. And the way in which that was done is by railroad. There were specially built trains that the wounded soldiers went into from the casualty clearing stations and made the long, slow trip back across the French countryside to the coastline, where the sequence of dozens of British Empire and French hospitals existed. The trains usually traveled by night because that's the only time it was safe for them to do it, to avoid the German bombers, and they traveled in the dark, that is, no lights on. And so they arrived at these hospitals on the French coast, and then all these wounded who came by the trainload were taken off the train, put on ambulances, and then taken to the local hospitals. But the hospitals sometimes were filled. The hospital that Ruth belonged to was No. 3 Canadian General Hospital, the McGill unit. It was a general hospital, which meant it was designed basically for 1,000 patients. But when there was a major battle on, like for instance the Battle of the Somme in 1916, which Ruth describes in some detail, or later on in 1917, Passchendaele in October 1917, there was an influx of wounded, and the hospital was expanded in size to 2,000 instead of 1,000. But when the hospital expanded from 1,000 patients to 2,000, the staff did not double. Matter of fact, usually it was the same people that had to look after double the number of wounded soldiers. And so when the trains unloaded them, there was usually a sequence of 3 hospitals locally. One hospital got filled up, then the ambulances went to the next hospital, then went to the next hospital. And the purpose of these hospitals was, of course, to treat the wounded. But once the wounded were treated, they didn't stay there. They were shipped literally taken down and shipped by ship back to England and the hospital system there, because there were more wounded to come from the front, more wounded to come from the battles. And so that gives you a bit of a logistical understanding of the situation in which Ruth was functioning at No. 3 General Hospital in France. Now, what did the nurses actually do? And this is where we begin to learn something about the extraordinary nature of the physical, emotional, and psychological stamina of these women, because they were amazing. What did the nurses do? Well, when these ambulances rolled up at the front of the hospital, it had to be, very often it was a nurse, maybe a nurse and a doctor, but very often when they were busy, it was only a nurse did the triage. They did the triage, and triage is that wonderful French word, which means who gets looked after and when. And basically there were, roughly there were 3 broad categories. One was the wounded that were wounded enough that they had to be there, obviously, but they weren't going to die right away if they didn't get treated. So they were put to the side somewhere else where they could be gotten to later in another ward to wait. Then there were those who needed to be operated on immediately. There was a leg that had to be amputated. There was a chest wound that had to be dealt with. They were bleeding badly and it had to be dealt with. These were rushed into surgery immediately. And usually the McGill unit had their X-ray machine, X-ray unit just beside the surgery unit. And McGill unit developed was in the forefront of developing X-ray techniques so they could locate where the shrapnel was in the man's chest or in the man's head from looking at the X-rays, so the surgeons wouldn't have to go in digging around. They'd know exactly where to go to get it. And so that was the second category of wounded, those who needed to be treated immediately. The third category were those for whom there was no perceptible hope. And they were put on another ward, a whole ward devoted to this, and made as comfortable as possible so that they could die in relative peace with the morphine that was being administered to them. Now, when I mention morphine, that brings me to another very important aspect of Great War medicine and nursing. There were no antibiotics. This is before the development of antibiotics. Antibiotic sulfa drugs came out during the Second World War, but no such thing existed during the Great War. There were no antibiotics. And this is particularly telling and important because the Great War was fought in the French countryside, in the farmers' fields that had been manured for centuries in order to have the crops grow. So that meant that every wound, whether it was a neat little bullet wound that drove the clothing of the man into his flesh, or whether it was a gasping shrapnel wound that tore a limb or a part of his anatomy off, it was always filled with this mud and this dirt from the fields, all full of microorganisms that were going to grow. And so with no antibiotics, there was only, basically one approach. First approach was if the limb was too badly damaged or too badly infected, it had to be amputated, particularly the case of something known as gas gangrene. The other thing was the wounds were kept open. They were cleaned and irrigated once they were cleaned. And so the surgeon would open up, for instance, a leg wound and clean it all out. And rather than sewing it all up again, the soldier would often go back to the ward under the nurse's care with a system of drips and irrigation systems, tubes and bottles, irrigating that wound to make sure all the dirt was out of it and no microorganism could grow and infect it and thereby kill the soldier. And so the nurses had the care of these soldiers, and some of the care they had to perform and provide was a sort of care which doesn't exist any longer. Because of course now we're just pumping full of intravenous antibiotics, but that wasn't a possibility in those days. So these series of bottles and tubes irrigating these wounds to keep them clean. And thereby to save the soldier's life. Though the other thing that was important in Great War nursing was cleanliness. The best way to fight against infections and disease that they had was to make sure everything was clean as possible. And of course, as we know during the time of COVID, it's not just a matter of cleaning, it's a matter of disinfecting. And so everything had to be disinfected that was going to go anywhere near the soldier. This, of course, meant all the surgical instruments, of course, they had to be boiled. And so cleanliness and disinfecting, and sometimes it was pretty crude things, with pure alcohol, with iodine, the disinfecting took place. And so that was another great responsibility that the nurses had in the wards. Now, in this connection, it's important to realize that the surgeons saw the soldiers perhaps in the operating table, and maybe the next day, if they weren't still in surgery nonstop from the previous day, they might drop by to see how the patient was doing, and they'd be there for a minute or two. It was the nurses who had the permanent care of the soldiers in the wards. It wasn't the doctors, it was the nurses who were present day and night for as long as the soldiers were in that particular ward, in that particular hospital. So it was the nurses who saw all these wounds, treated all these men, spoke to all these men, tried to save the lives of all these men as they struggle for their lives in these wards after the surgery and the operations. And also, they're the ones who would write their mothers or their sweethearts or their wives home when the soldier was conscious and wanting to send a message home, even if perhaps they weren't going to survive. It was also the nurses who received letters from the families afterwards. Perhaps the soldier did die, and the family would write a letter back to the nurses. So this is another unappreciated aspect of Great War nursing. The nurses were a conduit between the wounded soldier and the home front, a conduit between the families and the soldier. And the nurses had a profoundly important role in doing that, and something which is often forgotten and underappreciated. Now, speaking about other things that the nurses did very often, and Ruth refers to this particularly in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme, the wounded came in so quickly by the trainload that there wasn't the time to do what was supposed to be done. What was supposed to be done was that soldiers were supposed to be stripped. All their uniforms and everything that was coated with Somme mud and blood was to be taken, cut off them, and thrown away. And they would be put in hospital uniforms. And they, of course, were to be cleaned. But during these great battles, there wasn't time to do that. There were just too many wounded soldiers to deal with. And so the nurses were dealing with, in their wards, that was supposed to be spick and span clean to prevent disease and the spread and infection, they had a whole ward full of soldiers coated in mud and blood from the battlefield. And also, sometimes, their clothing saturated with poison gas. And the nurses sometimes would spend, Ruth mentions, spending a day bent over these sorts of soldiers, tending to their wounds and receiving the effects of the gas that was still on their uniforms. So that's another hazard that the nurses had. Also, there's this very, very cryptic, not really cryptic, but short mention in July the 5th, 1916 in the diary. Ruth says that she was in the ward working all day, many soldiers in their uniforms, and she said, "I'm just crawling." Well, what does that mean? It means that all the lice that were on the soldiers were transferring to the nurses, and the nurses couldn't do anything about it. They had to do their job, they had to do their duty, they had to minister to the wounded soldiers, and the lice were being transferred to the nurses. So this is why sometimes in the diary you hear that Ruth and her friend Claire from Shubenacadie, a fellow nurse, Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, went down to the local town, and the big deal was they had their hair washed. And you might say, well, that's a little bit much, them making such a big deal over getting their hair washed. There's a war going on, don't they? Well, they don't well know that there's a war going on, but the nurses are she's commenting on this great event where finally she's getting all the lice and the lice eggs out of her hair. That's what the big deal is about having her hair washed when she went into the nearby town. So those are sort of some of the subtle things that was necessary to put a footnote there or to write a more extensive introduction to explain what was going on in the background, so that as you read the diary of Ruth Logie, you can appreciate some of the things that are being referenced. Now, two other things that I should mention at this time. One is that disease was prevalent. There was trench fever for the soldiers, but there are also things like the common cold and various flus, the regular ones, not Spanish, but also measles. Ruth feels miserable for a while, and she ends up with measles and is whisked away from her hospital over to number 28 British Hospital, because that was a quarantine hospital for everybody in the area who had measles. And Ruth had to stay there the better part of 2 weeks in isolation. And her friends would come visit her when she was there. Her good friend Claire Gass from Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, she and another nurse came and visit her. But also, some of the medical staff visited her, and one of the medical staff that visited Ruth when she was recovering from the measles was a fellow by the name of Colonel John McCrae, because this is the McGill unit, and the McGill unit is the unit of Colonel John McCrae, the writer of In Flanders Fields. Matter of fact, in Ruth's diary, In Flanders Fields is written out in her diary. And she knew Colonel McCrae. He actually was one of the surgeons in the McGill unit. Yes, he had been separated from it, and he was part of the artillery during the Second Battle of Ypres in April-May 1915, before the McGill unit got to the continent, and then afterwards he went back to the McGill unit and functioned there for most of the rest of the war. And so they were acquaintances of one another, and Colonel McCrae actually came and visited Ruth. Now, finally, another thing which is mentioned in Ruth's diary is bombs. Now, we don't usually think about this, or I didn't usually think about this in respect to the Great War, but this is when, during the Great War, is when bombing from the skies began. We usually think about the Blitz in the Second World War and all the bombing that took place during that conflict, but it actually all began in the First World War. The German would send blimps and Zeppelins over England to bomb the cities. Later on, they developed bombers that could go that far. But this same railroad track system that brought the wounded soldiers from the front, or just behind the front, the casualty clearing stations, to the French coast at night to this enormous hospital system, and there were dozens of hospitals at the French coast, including a fair number of Canadian ones. That same rail system is the same rail system that brought the men and the supplies and the material, the ammunition, the water, the food from the coast and from England and the Empire to the front to support all the troops in the sharp end. So the rail line and its terminus at the French coast was an obvious target for German bombing. And starting in 16, Ruth makes mention of a German bombing run, and that is something which would continue in intensity for the rest of the war, and by a year later, in May of 1917, become very serious indeed, hospitals being hit, doctors and nurses being killed, including Canadians. And so that is something else to keep in mind as we think about the Great War and the nurses involved in it. Now, I have mentioned here in passing, Ruth had a great friend, and her name was Claire Gass of Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia. She was a little bit younger than Ruth, but she'd gone to Montreal General, received her education there. They were in the same unit together, in the McGill unit, and they were overseas together. And amazingly, Claire Gass's diary, as well as Ruth's, but Claire Gass's diary has come down to us over the course of the time. In the year 2000 was actually published. And for the 19 months that Ruth's diary overlaps Claire's diary, they mention one another 150 times each. So they were good friends indeed. Seldom did they room together, but they were good friends, and they did things in their off time in order to help them cope with the stresses and strains of what they were seeing. And that's something else to be reminded of in the reading of the diary. When Ruth first gets to the continent and first sees the wounds, she comments on how horrible they are, how dreadful they are, the limbs missing, the young fellow with his chin blowing off, just absolutely horrible, mind-numbing suffering. But then a month or so later, no mention of the wounds. Why? Because it's something that she had encountered, been shocked by, but now it was usual occurrence. That level of injury and that level of suffering, it's what the nurses were dealing with every day. Matter of fact, it can be argued that while the typical soldier in the Great War, say a Canadian soldier in the infantry in the trenches, experienced, say, 2, maybe 3 battles during the course of his time overseas, major battles in which he saw his friends, etc., being killed around him. But the nurses saw the end result of that suffering on a daily basis, and it was brought to them in the hospitals by the trainload, literally. So it can be argued that the nurses knew more about the effects of modern industrialized warfare than even the soldiers in the trenches, because the nurses were on the receiving end of what this resulted, what this created. If they survived and weren't buried at the front, they were coming back to the hospitals, and there the nurses saw them and ministered to them. Now, how did they deal with this? How did they cope with this psychologically? And that is one of the great reasons why I have become interested in the Great War nurses, because they are an extraordinary group of women with respect to their physical stamina and with respect to their psychological stamina. Now, for instance, Ruth and her friend Claire would go on little shopping excursions to the nearby town. They would go for walks in the surrounding area around Boulogne on the French coast. But also they rented a bicycle. And bicycle rides, they went around the various area. And actually, they bought a book called Peeps into Picardy, and it was a tourism travel guide created just about 4 years before the war broke out, and they bought it and used it to tell them where to go and what the local sites were to see. And I bought a copy of that and actually followed their adventures across the French coastline and inland, and Google Map on the one hand and this book in the other to follow where Claire and Ruth were going. But in their diary, it's either Claire or Ruth, I don't know which one of the two girls it was, but they mention they even comment on their own stamina. Both Claire and Ruth had worked a night shift in those wards. And the next morning, rather than being exhausted and going to bed, they look at one another, well, let's have a bite to eat and then go for a ride. And they got on their bicycles and they rode more than 30 kilometers and then came back, had a bite to eat, and then went to bed in order to work the night shift in their wards again that night. And they comment on what sort of constitution they must, they reflected, well, we must be pretty tough old birds in order to be able to do all this, both physical and psychological, and deal with everything that's going on. So that is part of what was being done by the nurses to help deal with the situations they were completely immersed in during the war. Also, of course, there was socialization. Usually the nurses had their own mess tent area. Sometimes they would socialize with the doctors, but that wasn't all the time by any means. And also the nurses would throw sometimes, for instance, a Halloween costume party. We come down, actually in the pages of Ruth's diary was an invitation that Claire had written out in calligraphy handwriting to a Halloween costume party that was held at Halloween in 1915. First, there was a party for the nurses who had invited the doctors and the staff to come, and then a week or so later there was a equal party put on by the nurses, none of the officers allowed, none of the men allowed, for those in their wards, the men who were there recovering. So that gives you some idea of the sorts of things the nurses were doing, both to cope and also to help those around them to cope with what was going on, to endure and persevere in the midst of this pain and the suffering and the sort of work that the nurses themselves were doing. What happened to Ruth as time went by? Ruth's diary is 19 continuous months, and it is a war diary. It begins in May in 1915 when she signed up in Montreal, and it goes all the way through, trip overseas, trip to France, and working there for 19 months, and then it ends in November 1916. Claire, her friend's diary, continues, but with very little written in it for the rest of 1916. It would appear that by that point in 16, Ruth was run down by November. The Battle of Somme had come to an end after the Canadians got involved in September, the Battle of Courcelette, and great heavy casualties, including people that they knew and relatives of nurses that were serving in the McGill unit. There was sickness within the unit. There were transfers out of the unit to other hospitals that were more desperate for staff, and they were just completely run down and run off their feet. And Ruth ceased to make entries in her diary in November. And if she did take up diary writing again in the next year, in 17, it hasn't come down to us. But we do have her military record, and her military record shows what she did in a very cursory fashion. It shows her going on leave a few times in 1917 and 18, leave to England usually. She continued to work away at No. 3 Canadian General Hospital in Boulogne on the French coast, and then as her friend Claire in 17 had been moved forward to a casualty clearing station. So in August of 1918, Ruth was moved forward to a casualty clearing station near the front as well. This was the ultimate and most challenging possible destination for Great War Canadian nurses, to go to the casualty clearing station just behind the front lines. They were entirely under the umbrella of German artillery. The places were shelled and were sometimes closed because it wasn't safe to be there. The casualties were fresh off the battlefield, and it was a place of extremely intense work and intense trauma and stress as well. And that's where Ruth spent the end of her war in the fall of 1918. After that, she comes back to number 3 for a while, and then back to England, and then is demobilized back in Canada, in Ottawa. And then she spent the rest of her working life in the Montreal area, along with Claire, her friend Claire, in the Montreal area doing nursing. And then in the late 30s, 38, 39, she's called home to Burnt Church, New Brunswick, to look after her aging parents. And there, by the end of the First World War, her brothers died, her both parents have died. And then by the late 1950s, it's just her and her closest sister, Ray, whose real name is Rachel, was referred to in the diaries Ray, R-A-E. Rachel is just Ruth and Rachel left. And Rachel passes away in 1960, the year I was born, and Ruth lives until 1968 and passes away. And that's the end of the family line, because amazingly, despite the fact that she was one of 7 children born in the 1880s and 1890s, not one of her siblings ever married. So there's no aunts and uncles, no nephews and nieces to be the caretakers of these 2 volumes of diary. But nonetheless, we're very fortunate they did come down through the Anderson side, her mother's side of the family, and I was able to view them and publish them in this book, A Canadian Nurse in the Great War, the Ruth Logie Diaries. And that is how this rare document, this special document, this document that gives us a peek into an unknown aspect of the Great War, has come down to us over 100 years later. Thank you very much for listening. I'll close things up there at this time and be ready to take any questions that folks may have. Okay, then yes, comment from Stella that her father-in-law was wounded behind enemy lines and reported missing in action during the Second World War, and appreciates the sort of information about the medical system that existed during the wars. You're most welcome. Okay, a question here. After delving into the actual letters and diaries, I'm asked, do I feel that I actually know the people? Yes, at a certain level, one does know them as much as one can know another person, particularly with these diaries of Ruth, when it's combined with Claire's, and you get the not just what Ruth wrote for herself, which is primarily what this diary is about, but also what Claire wrote for herself and about Ruth at the same time, and their travels, particularly in their bicycle rides and their visiting to restaurants and visiting the towns for shopping and that sort of thing, the things they did to decompress. You do begin to understand, begin to know, I think, the people that are involved. Although it's, we always have to be, not too filled up with ourselves, is thinking that we can fully appreciate what the world was like 100 years ago and the world 100 years ago in the midst of global conflict. But nonetheless, yes, there is a sense in which one can come to know. And I mean, it's, probably one of the best ways to come to know someone from that time period, but also to understand them within the context of that time period. Thank you. Okay, how important is it for these documents to survive and be shared, and what can they teach us? Well, obviously, I think it's exceedingly important that these documents have survived. I close my comments with saying how almost miraculous, but so statistically, it shouldn't have happened that these particular diaries in a family in which there were, no children, no nephews, aunts, and uncles, these 2 volumes have come down to us. So that's a particular gift from that time period to ours. But also it's a very, I think that from the perspective of women's studies, is an extraordinary gift from the women, and some very strong and characters, and some very motivated and indeed even inspirational women from 100 years ago. Their story has come down to the present period. And it is as a result, and this is something that they can teach us, it is as a result of the work, the character, and the discipline, and the fortitude of these Canadian Army Medical Corps nurses, these nursing sisters. They have bequeathed to us in certain things, and certainly helped bring some things about. It's no simple coincidence that women received the vote in Canada shortly after the Great War ended. Matter of fact, these nurses, Ruth and her friend Claire, voted in the federal election of December 1917. All the nurses serving overseas were given the vote in that election, and that's no coincidence. And then when they came home, quite a few of these nurses, many of them didn't marry, when they came home, they moved into and created new fields. Public health was one of them, and various aspects of social work was another. The nurses knew and could prove that social conditions had an impact on health and well-being, and even the ability of the person to work. And so too, they knew about the importance of public health. And if the Canadian public didn't know that before the influenza or Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, that was a lesson in point. And the nurses knew about these sorts of things. And so when they came back, they moved into and helped create new fields of social work and new fields of public health. It's at this time, post-World War I, that public health nurses came into existence, and traveling circuit nurses in places out west, for instance, in the small settlements. Those things came about, and it was often Great War nurses who had the stamina and the know-how and the reputation to be able to do that sort of work. So yes, we can learn a great deal from these ladies and from the information that's come down over the course of time about them. Have I ever thought of writing fiction? Yes, I have thought of it, and it's a fleeting thought, let me assure you. I prefer, and my wife could back this up, I prefer things that really happened, because I think that if we do the right sort of digging, we can find that actual history, actual lives lived, are not just as interesting, but indeed more interesting than the greatest fiction, because fiction at its best reflects, may I suggest, life itself, whereas life itself is the most interesting and the most lived reality of all. And so, yes, I've thought about fiction, but if I can continue to dig up things like Ruth Logie's diary, I think I'll continue to do that. Because it's most interesting and most fulfilling to find these actual things that did take place, and these actual people who did live and breathe the same air that we do.
Does anyone else have any questions out there? There's people watching. Is there anything you'd like to know from Ross before we sign off? No, it's a quiet bunch.
It's a quiet bunch this evening. Perhaps I've spoken so much there's nothing more to be said, although I doubt it.
Well, thank you very much, Ross. And if you're interested in getting a Canadian nurse, you can get it from independent bookstores or Indigo or Amazon or at nimbus.ca, and as you can with any of Ross's books. And I'm sure if you live close by, he'd be happy to sign them for you.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. No problem whatsoever.
Well,
Thank you.
And Oh, I see a comment before we sign off. I don't want to leave anybody out.
Is this my first book? No, actually, it's my third on the Great War. First one came out in 2014, and it was known as Letters Home. I put it here without,
Yeah.
Letters Home. And this is a collection of letters from 20 different individuals during the Great War, including a nurse from Petitcodiac, New Brunswick. The second book came out at the end of the Great War anniversary, 2018, and it's called In Their Own Words. And it's a collection of letters from 3 individuals. And if I'm right, doing it blindly, this is the lobster fisherman from PEI who was conscripted. This is the soldier, the railroad man from Bridgetown, Nova Scotia. And this is the nurse from, again, another nurse, from Centerville, New Brunswick. And this is the complete set of letters from the Great War. So it gives you the complete picture of their war experience. Rather than the first book, which was just individual letters and individual topics, that second volume was the complete story of those individuals during the war. And the soldier from Bridgetown, Nova Scotia, actually is statistically unique in that he signed up in August of 1914, actually fought at the front for the whole war and survived, though he was wounded, and came home in 1919. But he came home with something new, an English war bride. War brides are common from the Second World War and quite well known in our society, but I didn't realize that there were 10,000 English war brides in the First World War, and that's a statistic I didn't know at all. The sort of thing you learn. Fiction, real life, perhaps better than fiction. So that's the story from the Great War. Thank you.
Well, if that's all for questions, I guess we'll sign off and hope that you can all make it out to the cenotaph on Remembrance Day and think about our veterans from all the wars. Thanks very much.
Including the nurses. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.